Good morning, gamers. Hello. Let's say that you were a samurai who hypothetically wanted to parse. And let's say that you hypothetically were a good player with a solid understanding of the job. Now let's throw in a curveball and say that samurai has a raid buff, and in order for you, a good samurai player with a raid buff, to be the parse lord you want to be, you need the other jobs in your party to do damage in your raid buff. Oh, what? You would want them to do whatever they could to feed your raid buff? Interesting. Then let's talk about when and how we can do that as a normal samurai without a raid buff for our raid team. Our DPS jobs and players with raid buffs love playing with samurai, and it's for a good reason. Not only are samurai great at putting damage into raid buffs, but they're also great at moving around their cooldowns and abilities to play around mechanics or non-standard buff timings. And since their kit has become much more flexible since Endwalker, this in turn allows them to choose the route of playing selfish or selfless. But what's the difference between playing selfish or selfless, and what does it really mean? Let's talk about it. For those who are unfamiliar with how samurai works, the core of samurai's rotation revolves around using different combos and abilities to generate and spend their resources on hard-hitting GCDs like Madari Setsugeka, or consistent throughput in the form of OGCDs with Shinten. But samurai has a very easy time choosing when and how they want to use these resources, and this is where we see a lot of samurai playstyles vary. Because while samurai is quite intuitive to learn, and in my opinion has one of the lower skill floors in the game, playing it at a high level does have some nuance to it, but luckily the concepts aren't too difficult to grasp. But in the process of learning samurai, there seem to be some concepts that fall through the cracks or just get flat out ignored by many players. And this results in various samurai players with varying playstyles. So let's look at these varying playstyles on a moving scale, with one end representing a more selfish playstyle and the other end representing a more selfless playstyle. Now, in general, it doesn't really matter where you lie on the scale, because you should learn to adapt your playstyle to your environment, and various fight mechanics will require various techniques. But I'd like to show you the pros and cons of the extreme ends of the scale and help you decide when and how you should use them. Let's start with everyone's favorite, Selfish Samurai. Selfish Samurai is a playstyle that you will see in most parses on FF logs. This usually involves a couple of things, such as Miekyo only being used on finishers like Gecko and Kasha, Iki Shoten being used as soon as it comes off a cooldown, Kinki and meditation stacks being used as soon as they become available, and the most common one that I see is no uses of Hagakure or filler. Now it makes sense as to why a lot of players would gravitate towards this playstyle, especially when we start looking at the strengths and benefits of this playstyle. The first approach of only using Miekyo for Gecko and Kasha just makes too much sense on paper. Gecko and Kasha are both 370 potency finishers, while Yukikaze is a 280 potency finisher, so using a stack of Miekyo on 280 potency over a 370 potency ability is a raw loss of 90 potency. Moving on to using Iki Shoten off a cooldown, this also makes total sense, especially in a setting where you don't know your kill time or the boss is going to die very quickly inside of an even minute burst window. So making sure that you aren't losing a use of Iki Shoten, and in turn making sure that you aren't losing 2 casts of Namakuri, your hardest hitting ability, is also an easy choice to make and an overall benefit. And along the same note, using Iki Shoten gives you free resources, so using it off a cooldown also allows you to dump resources prior to your burst window, which allows a less hectic and less busy 2-minute window. And it also enables you to focus more on doing your rotation or other mechanics that may overlap with what would be a high octane part of the fight. And finally, not doing a filler or not using Hagakure in a fight can also be seen as a gain. Again, in situations where you don't know your kill time, doing a filler could end up costing you a Madare, thus making you lose out on 900 potency in some situations. So it makes perfect sense as to why the common assumption would be to not use a filler and play on the side of caution. Now, those were the strengths or pros of playing selfishly, but how do they stack up against the strengths and pros of playing selflessly? Selfless Samurai can be viewed as a playstyle that optimizes around raid buffs, and this will be more common in a speed setting or static setting. This playstyle most commonly includes varying Miekyo finisher usage, Iki Shoten being held for during raid buffs, Kinki and meditation stacks being held as much as possible for raid buffs, and usage of filler to properly align for raid buffs. Now, while the selfless playstyle does seem to have a lot of contrast to the selfish playstyle, and it may not have as much appeal on the surface due to the direct potency loss of some of these choices, there are benefits that we should talk about. When we talk about varying Miekyo finishers, we're mainly talking about situations where you would use Miekyo for all 3 of the samurai finishers. So not only Gecko and Kasha, but also Yukikaze. This does result in a raw potency loss of 90 like we talked about before, but this technique is primarily used to realign or gain Madare and Kaishi Setsugeka with raid buffs, and can sometimes be used as a reverse filler in the event of downtime, since you only end up using 1 GCD for Yukikaze instead of 2. For Iki Shoten, the benefit of holding this cooldown for raid buffs is that it allows you to generate more raid DPS, resulting in a faster kill time for what's essentially free, while also putting extra potency into other people's raid buffs, allowing them to gain our DPS. And this extra raid DPS from Iki Shoten is a direct result of using Shinten's under raid buffs that would have needed to be used prior to entering the burst window to ensure not overcapping if Iki Shoten was to be used off of cooldown. And finally, filler can also be seen as a gain to a samurai, not only for its ability to enable a faster kill time with better buff synchronization, but also to ensure extra Shinten uses that may have been lost if you were to indeed end the fight on a stack of Sen. Now, obviously, Selfish Samurai is much more appealing, and I don't blame players for putting all their eggs in this basket. There's lower risk with regards to cooldown usage and resource management. You don't really have to plan out as much since it's more of an if-then thought process, and it obviously works since most of the top samurai logs play this way. However, Selfish Samurai comes with its own issues. Not only can this playstyle result in a longer kill time since you're pushing more and more potency out of raid buffs, but it can also make people not want to bring you to their party because of that exact reason. Samurai has the highest burst potential in the game, a burst potential that people want in their raid buffs, and a burst potential that, if used properly, can reward you and your group with a better kill time. And when that potential for Samurai is lowered because of a more selfish playstyle, not only can the group's damage and parse suffer, but so can yours. But on the other hand, Selfless Samurai also has its own weaknesses. You're taking a large risk by holding cooldowns for buff windows, especially in a group that you're unfamiliar with. On top of that, you may be in a setting where you're unfamiliar with the strategies involved. And since most raid mechanics happen around high octane parts of the fight, it can get quite overwhelming to double weave every single GCD, especially when you're still learning a strategy for a mechanic that you don't really know how to handle yet. And not to mention the risk of overcapping resources or accidentally clipping by trying to squeeze extra potency at the end or front of people's raid buffs. It's definitely a more risky playstyle overall that requires a bit more processing and analyzing both in and outside of raid. But there are ways to find a middle ground where we can use the strengths of both playstyles to help counter the weaknesses of their opposition. And we can do this by focusing on 3 major goals for every single run we go into as a samurai. The first being to maximize our cooldown potency and raid buffs by prioritizing our big cooldowns like Namakiri, Kaishi Setsugeka, and Higenbana. We don't want these to fall outside of raid buffs at any cost, and this should be completely controllable by proper filler or proper use of fight mechanics to act as a filler to realign and ensure we get these into raid buffs. The second thing to focus on is trying to make sure the other GCDs that we use under raid buffs outside of those just mentioned are finishers like Gecko, Kasha, or Yukikaze. While Yukikaze is the least preferred of our 3 finishers, it's usually a gain over using a Hikaze, and in some cases can give us enough Kinki to fit an extra Shinten that normally wouldn't have made it into raid buffs. And finally, the last and probably most important thing to focus on is resource management. This is what separates good samurai from great samurai, and this is what gets you invited back to parse parties or could even land you a spot on a speed team. Knowing how to pool Kinki and meditation stacks for as long as possible to allow for the most uses of Shinten and Shoha under raid buffs, in my opinion, is the most valuable skill that you as a samurai can learn. And it can be accomplished by really focusing on your resources during downtime between burst windows and holding Iki Shoten for during raid buffs rather than just using it on cooldown. While this does take a bit more effort, if there was anything that I wish I saw more samurai players doing, it would be proper Kinki and meditation management by pooling resources as much as possible for buff windows. So at the end of the day, you need to find a playstyle that works best for you and your group. Obviously, you don't want to troll yourself by losing a use of a cooldown or something, but understand that you, a samurai, have a job to do in your party that isn't just doing damage. It's about placing the damage you do in the right spots. So if you take anything from this video, use the 3 steps that I just gave you, take time to review a log, analyze your gameplay, and pay attention to how you are managing your resources throughout the fight, not only for your group's benefit, but to make you a better player. So I hope this video was able to help you identify some areas where you may be able to adjust your playstyle a bit. I think I put Jojo to sleep talking this much. But I've been doing a lot of log reviews for samurais over the past couple of weeks, and these are just some really common things that I see people either just not understanding or maybe they just didn't know. And something to realize is that samurai as a job is kind of in a position where they're not necessarily mandatory anymore. Because, well, monk, dragoon, and ninja are pretty good right now, and if samurai players aren't playing into the strengths of samurai and do what samurai does best, i.e. dump into raid buffs, there's no real need to bring a samurai. I feel like I forgot to mention a melee job. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below, or you can drop by one of my Twitch streams. I stream quite frequently in the evening since we're doing speeds like every single night. Or if you'd like, you can join my Discord server and we can chat and hang out and shit post. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to watch my video, and have a great day. Goodbye.